Looking at the second reading from Machiavelli's The Prince. The Prince is a short book. It was written for somebody who probably didn't read long books, Lorenzo de Medici, and was written to be a useful, I don't know, exactly a manual for being a prince, but useful advice for being a prince. And we should have some notion of what that means, to be a ruler, to be the kind of ruler who exists, in a very competitive and difficult environment. I mean, people have been reading The Prince for centuries now, and books have been written for how it can be applied in business life, and how perhaps contemporary politicians could take it to heart. And I'm sure that is quite plausible, quite valid in its own way. But it was written for people who were trying to keep power in a very shifting, complex, and really cutthroat political environment in the Italy of the Renaissance. So the kind of advice that he gives for the prince, the person who's getting, keeping, regaining power, is really supposed to be very forthright, very frank, and really, one of the most striking things. It's different in different translations, and I don't read Italian, so I wish I did and could appreciate the original. I'm sure it's brilliant Italian prose, but you see this in different translations. The second paragraph of our reading, where he says, "Hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong." I don't know. That's another milestone, I would say. I mean, that's got every right to be considered one of those greatest hits of Western social thought that we started with. To know how to be bad, to know how to do wrong. I mean, it's, I don't know. I mean, what do I know? Machiavelli had a long experience, as he says in the dedication. He had a long experience directly observing the political events of his time. He was a rather low or mid-level diplomat or functionary of some sort for the Florentine Republic before it was destroyed. So he had, rather intimate view of political happenings. And he says also in that dedication to Lorenzo that he bases a lot of it on his study of antiquity, his study of classical history, which is basically the history of Greece and Rome. And in his estimation and his judgment, you just simply can't be a successful ruler unless you are willing to do things which are wrong, which is a very striking thing to say. And, what kind of thinker is Machiavelli? I'm casting this first part of the course, ancient, medieval, modern. Well, Machiavelli is the modern one, but I'm not really sure how modern he is. In many ways, he is a classical thinker. He is a thinker who's more like Aristotle than a contemporary political thinker in his methods. But in some ways, he does seem to be modern insofar as he seems to be saying, listen, we're talking about government here. We're talking about politics. So we're talking about power. And if we're talking about staying in power, we have to put aside our ideals. We have to put aside the idea that we want to be. It would be impossible to always be good and virtuous and be a successful prince. He seems to be saying that it's just mutually incompatible. You don't want people to hate you. You don't want them to resent you. You don't want, for its own sake, to be bad, but sometimes you have to be bad. I think, is the clear message. If you want to be a successful prince, really something, and really quite, I would say, quite a challenge. And reading Machiavelli for the first time, especially after reading these sort of earnest things like Aristotle's Politics, and we saw that, I think everyone agreed there are flaws in Aristotle, there are flaws in Dante, but he seemed to have this noble purpose, and maybe Machiavelli does too, if you consider helping a prince stay in power no matter what to be noble. Maybe in the long run that's good. I don't know. But he's not. He's very explicit about the fact that a lot of other writers have talked about principalities and republics which never existed. He says this in the first page. He says, "But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities, which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him amongst so much that is evil." The world, Machiavelli saw the world in very cold terms, a dog-eat-dog world. It's a nice guys finish last world. And if you want to play the game, you have to play it you have to play dirty, I guess, is what he's saying. Really remarkable and quite a challenge. I think chapter 16 concerning liberality and meanness is a really excellent example of the kind of thing that he's talking about. Of course, liberality is generosity. Liberality is being willing to spend and to give. Meanness would be Aristotle would say, would be the corresponding vice, where you're stinginess, being tight-fisted. And his advice there is really remarkable. And that is more or less, it seems, that, you should want the reputation for liberality, because everyone loves someone who's liberal, who's generous and giving. But make sure when you're generous in giving, you're generous in giving with somebody else's money rather than your own. And that is not just, he's not saying it's good to be greedy. What he's saying is that if you want to convince people as a prince, as a ruler, that you're generous, that you're liberal, you'll probably end up ruining yourself, because you won't have the resource. You'll be giving away the resources you need to stay in power. The best thing to do is to, in the long run, for your reputation, it's okay to be considered mean in the sense of stingy or tight-fisted. Because if you are careful in preserving your property, then you won't get stuck in a position where you have to be grasping by overtaxing your subjects or stealing from them. Reputations for liberality can dissipate very quickly if you're in an emergency and you basically have to expropriate people's property in order to conduct a war or do some other project. So, of course, you don't want to have a reputation for being stingy and mean, but it would be worse to ruin yourself in trying to get a reputation for liberality and then not having what you need to stay in power, or for being in a position where you really have to alienate people. So, the really remarkable advice, and the all along, the presumption seems to be it's the reputation that matters. At least when you're a prince, it's not the reality. It's what you can put over on people. It's the kind of reputation that you can gain. It's not the actual. If you could get the reputation for liberality without having to pay the costs of liberality, then that's great, right? Because it's the reputation that matters. People, I've always been shocked by Machiavelli. And because he does seem to be saying, listen, it's not only that it's okay as a prince to act unethically, to actually be a good prince, you are sometimes going to need to act unethically.